This program has been brought to you thanks to the generous contributions of our patrons on Patreon. Your patronage is greatly appreciated. And for more content like this, be sure to check out the Modern Alchemist channel on Patreon.
Shall we begin? Let's begin now.
All right, so then the benefits clearly with rhythm are that things will begin, that there's always going to be a new beginning. And of course the cost is, no matter how good things are, all good things come to an end. And just as much as anything that's bad. So it can be taken then that rhythm is the ultimate scale upon which all things are balanced. So all things which are created rely upon this principle. And the principle starts and it finishes and it starts again. It is quite literally the eternal Brahman who opens his eyes and the universe comes into being, and then he closes his eyes or blinks and the universe disappears, and he opens his eyes again and there it is, the universe is back. And that is rhythm. That's the cycle of all things. So that's the pluses and the minuses of rhythm. What can we do as people? What can we do as human beings to polarize ourselves against this relentless swing? Because there are some things that you do want to retain, or you want to minimize the absence of by polarizing yourself in such a way so that you can retain those vibrations, those states of being over the long run, over all things, right? And minimize its volatility. Well, let's talk about it. This is the part of our discussion where the rubber meets the road and we become very practical in our practice of alchemy. What do I mean by that? Well, as the Kybalion has informed us earlier, alchemy is, at its core, the practice of mental transmutation, or the transmutation of mental states, which then can have an impact on the physical world around us. And that these principles embody the functions and operational principles that the universe abides within. So, in order for us to take advantage of the principle of rhythm, we need to understand how to polarize ourselves against its effects through the application of an understanding of the principle of vibration. This is the part where all of this is starting to come together, okay? More than any other part, you're going to see everything build right to this point, like two cymbals coming together, clashing, boom, and the concept will be revealed. The key is actually quite simple. The key is a recognition of what drives you in one direction or the other, and all of this requires that you take some personal responsibility. That's the core of all of it, that you as a human being recognize that you are subject to the laws of rhythm, the principles of rhythm, but you do not have to be fully and completely subject to it, that by applying a higher principle or a higher law, that you can then have dominion over the lower principle. And since polarization and vibration represent higher principles, then you can use those principles as a way of armoring yourself against the principle of rhythm. The key is understanding what makes rhythm volatile. And by doing this, I'd like to use an electric universe analogy. Within the electromagnetic spectrum, you have high frequency, high vibration light, like ultraviolet, gamma rays, X-rays, and then you have low frequency, low vibration light, like infrared or microwaves, right? These are very, very low frequency, very low vibration. And in between that, of course, we have the visual spectrum, which is this tiny little area. The idea behind electromagnetism is that high frequency, high vibratory light has greater capacitance, meaning that it can store and transmit more energy, which is why it's high frequency, high vibration, and why it is so disruptive to low frequency, low vibration, which has a lower capacitance. So, and the way to think of it is to look at consider the caduceus staff, which has the two serpents, creating a sine wave. When capacitance is disrupted, it's like that little bubble popping, right? Because it can no longer store the energy within, and it pops apart, it explodes. The capacitance is destroyed. So that's why we have things called capacitors, right? In electronics, those are designed to hold a certain amount of power, and when that is too much, then the capacitor blows up. So the idea then from this metaphor is that there's a direct application to consciousness, so that when you are in a low vibratory state, you have a reduced degree of capacitance, meaning that you can only take in so much of your environment before it becomes extremely disruptive to your mental state. Anybody who's been in the throes of a black depression knows this is true. There's nothing more painful than being in that space and having someone cheerful roll in and just try to pull you together and get you going. I mean, it just literally can become physically painful, and cause other negative emotions to emerge, like snaps of anger, right? And it really is you snapping, which is again that idea of your capacitance breaking and the energy erupting outward, right? Like a solar flare, So when you are at a higher vibratory state, you can take a lot more from your environment because you have higher capacitance, all right? So with regard to this then, you need to understand what it is about yourself that can increase or decrease your capacitance. What makes you strong and what makes you vulnerable. While this will require some meditation, this will require you to explore yourself. Hey, this is not just for you to make your life that much more wonderful, because I'm telling you from my own experience, it makes it that much better to understand what fills you up and makes you snap and how to reduce that effect, right? What are the keys to reducing that? And that, of course, makes life better for everyone around you. Certainly, right? Okay, so the key then is actually everything works nicely in this idea in threes. The crown of all of this in the negative spectrum is pride. And the way to define pride in these terms so that you understand, pride is the elevation of the subjective self to the standpoint of preeminence, so that I am this and I am that, and it bleeds into the middle self to the extent then that one might utter, no one dares to treat me that way. Okay? These are just examples of what we might say or think that result from the balance of your inner self favoring the subjective self, to the exclusion to where it's so deafening that the objective self barely has a voice. It's nothing but a tiny little whisper, okay? So the subjective self is inflamed, it's I am this, I am that, and then it bleeds into the middle self, no one treats me like that, and now you're moving into action. All of this is and by the way, the lower vibratory states always come from the subjective self. And it's fitting because the subjective self then is identified with salt, which is identified with binah, which is identified with the ether, right? So the subjective self is all about those concepts, those ideas, they all correspond there, okay? The objective self is always a much higher vibratory state. It has greater scope and vision because it's objective. And you can create bleed over from one side or the other depending upon your emotional state. So pride is definitely the granddaddy of all subjective self motivators, which then create things like grudges, and create things like buried feelings. And essentially, the grudge is then the subjective self seeking a means whereby it can assert itself against the offending party. And a grudge can last forever, just like the wavelength of a low vibratory state can be really long, right? But have very low capacitance. So it just is this long wavelength with a very low wave height and a low capacitance, but it seems to last forever, right? And anyone who's known anyone who is deeply prideful, who held grudges, you've seen that, where a grudge can last for years or even longer than that. It's so bad, it's such a human trope of negativeness that it's a trope in fiction, where these grudges last for, generations. And then the thing that goes hand in hand with grudges, burying your feelings, which, again, this is pride stating itself, the subjective self saying, I can't take it. It's too much, I can't deal with it. It's always I can't, I this, I that. It's a statement of being, but it's always the subjective self that's negating something.